Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. Welcome, Lina, to the podcast. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So after 14 years of civil war in Syria, 24 years of rule by Bashar al-Assad, and more than 50 years of Assad dynastic rule, Syria has this week been transformed. In a week, everything has changed. Assad's regime has been toppled by a coalition of rebels, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and Syrians seem to be celebrating. For most people, it feels as though this has all happened very quickly. But Lina, you've been following this for a while, and indeed you've written about the latest developments for us on the Prospect website. Tell us, were you also surprised by the pace and the scale of change this week?
I was surprised about the plan to topple him, because that had been planned for a while. What I was surprised about was that the plan would work out in such a short period of time. Because just because there's a plan doesn't mean it will actually work. But I think the speed in which this regime fell at the end shows how much of a hollow regime it was. In a way, I hope all the skeptics that, had been deluding themselves that this Syrian regime basically was never going to fall, it was never going to be toppled through a military campaign, are now, having a very good look at what is happening actually in Syria. And I think, to be honest, a lot of people may have missed this, including policymakers, is because they were choosing to look at the frameworks that made them comfortable, the things they were used to that meant minimal action on their part, as opposed to the things that seemed to them far-fetched simply because they were using the wrong tools to address this conflict. And so here we are. It's a new era, not just for Syria, but for the Middle East at large.
Yeah. I mean, so you say that it wasn't a surprise that there was a plan. What were the signs that there was a plan being formed? What had you heard before this actually began?
I mean, first of all, the Syrian rebels, with their different denominations, never stopped working. And if you look at how they have transformed over the last few years, you will have seen that the groups are not what they used to be. Even, say, 9 years ago, when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham began its transformation from what used to be called al-Nusra, which was a group affiliated with al-Qaeda, to a group that had political ambition. I myself wrote a piece in 2015 about this transformation, saying at that time that this group seems to be heading towards political pragmatism, seems to be heading away from al-Qaeda. And at that time, a lot of people dismissed what I said, because to them, the comfortable framework was to look at this group simply from the prism of Islamic or Islamist jihadism. And I can, name other examples regarding the other groups on the ground that basically were learning from their own mistakes, learning that having a shared cause and cooperating is better than competing with one another. These things, don't happen overnight. Meanwhile, internationally, there was increasing recognition, even by Assad's key ally, Russia, that this regime is not really what can guarantee Russia's long-term influence in Syria. Russia recognized that there are pragmatists, even amongst the Syrian opposition, who were open to some sort of political deal. And this was not a secret. Some of these groups were going to Moscow quite openly to meet with Russian officials to talk about this. But as I said, the issue is that a lot of outside observers and mainly Western diplomats were choosing to ignore all this because they didn't think it was significant. They were so used to Assad being in power and the Assad family being in power, because they had been in power for, half a century. It was just difficult to see an alternative reality, but the reality was actually what is unfolding right now.
Yeah.
So 14 years ago, civil war breaks out in Syria, and at some point it becomes less a civil war and more a war. Lots of different actors, international actors getting involved, people coming to join some of the rebel groups to fight with them as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the geopolitical factors, the actors that contributed to Assad falling, as well as the sort of the action of the rebel groups?
I personally do not like to refer to Syria's war as a civil war, simply because from the very beginning, the very first crackdowns on the Syrian protesters who were protesting peacefully and who the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad and his allies cracked down on, that crackdown happened with the help of Iran and Hezbollah. At that time, Iran and Hezbollah were acting in a so-called advisory capacity to Bashar al-Assad, advising him on the best way to crush a peaceful opposition. You may remember Iran, for example, had experience with the Green movement, which it crushed through sheer brutality. And so they had experience that they could, sadly advise Assad through. And this is why from the very beginning, it had Hezbollah, it had Iran involved. Of course, Russia didn't get involved militarily until 2015, so 4 years later. But then also from the very beginning, around 2012, you had Turkey intervening because it saw in the Syrian scenario that was unfolding an opportunity to increase its influence and crush the Kurds. So you had that. Of course, then you had the rise of ISIS around 2013. Till 2015, that was a period of huge activity by this terrorist group, which of course resulted in the intervention of the international community through eventually forming the global coalition against Daesh. And so basically you have all those international actors, as well as, of course, the Syrian opposition in their different factions that had external patrons over the years. Of course, all these things shifted, but you had Qatar, Saudi Arabia, also Turkey, backing some of those factions on and off, whether politically or militarily. These things, again, didn't stay constant. And so basically this was, for me, from the very beginning, an international conflict playing out in Syria. And a key thing to remember is that the reason why Iran intervened so early on is because Syria forms the linchpin in Iran's regional influence in the Middle East. Without Syria, Iran would lose this influence because Syria is where Hezbollah, which is the most important proxy for Iran in the region, used to train its troops, used to get its weapons through from Iran. And later on in the conflict, Syria also, of course, became a money-making kind of a platform for Hezbollah through its involvement in the drug trade and other illicit activities. So for Iran, losing Hezbollah would be a huge blow to its regional influence. And to sustain Hezbollah, it needed this land bridge, which is Syria. That's why it invested in supporting the Assad regime until the very end. And so you will see this campaign that ousted Assad was primarily targeting not just the Assad regime's forces, but also Iranian militias that were in Syria. And it was Iran that did not see this coming. It's interesting that the rebels' main targets were not Russian. They were Iranian and Assad regime. And this is why I'm saying we need to look at the big picture, all the political discussions that had been taking place quite pragmatically, which evolved over time, of course. So yeah, Syria, from the beginning has been an international conflict. And for me, this also means that what happens in Syria now with the transition should also be an international responsibility. Let's not forget the key role of the US in all this. The US, of course, funded, and the UK did, of course, some of the rebel groups that were considered moderate at certain points in the conflict. However, this is never enough to topple a regime as entrenched as Assad, especially back in the day when it was still relatively strong. However, of course, famously, the US and the UK basically disengaged in 2013 when President Obama said that the use of chemical weapons in Syria would be a red line. and then did not actually act upon the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. And I think, the situation since then became a lot more comfortable for Russia and Iran in Syria, so that even if Iran was feeling militarily exposed, which is why the Russians had to intervene in 2015, deep down, they felt that actually the international community did not really want to get rid of Assad. And that, in a way, gave them hope to carry on instead of thinking, well, maybe we should calculate differently. So I think, the Syrian conflict is obviously and remains very, very complex, but we have to really have clarity regarding whose responsibility it was to allow this regime to last for as long as it did.
I mean, one of the really remarkable, or some of the really remarkable pictures, I guess, from recent days have been the celebrations that you've seen among Syrians. I mean, footage of people being released from prison after so many years and, some of them completely confused about the world that they're re-emerging into, kind of queues of traffic as well as Syrians return to try and find their family and find their homes. What are you hearing from Syrians who you've spoken to and people who are kind of in the middle of this transformation?
I mean, there's a lot of hope. People are saying no matter what happens next, it will be nowhere near as horrible as what they were going through under the Assad regime. And I think the footage that are now appearing in the public domain from prisons like the notorious Saidnaya prison are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of showing the world what the Syrian people have been enduring. Sadly, this is not the first time that this kind of evidence visually appears. We have to remember one of the military figures known as Caesar had leaked 50,000 images of maimed bodies that the Syrian regime had basically been responsible for through imprisoning people and killing them after torturing them. All this was leaked. It was in the public domain a decade ago. And although it led to an act in the US about impunity and called the Caesar Act, this did not result in the world basically doing something to really get rid of what to me looks like the most brutal regime of our time. I mean, I haven't looked at what's going on behind closed doors in places like North Korea, for example. So I can't 100% say, but from what I've seen over the last 50 years, this is definitely the most brutality I have ever come across. And the stories are not new. The stories of what has been going on behind those closed doors of these notorious prisons, rightly called slaughterhouses, is something that whoever was lucky enough to survive were telling the outside world. It's just that the outside world, was not really listening. And policy did not change as a result of evidence coming out, even if the evidence was credible, like the Caesar files. And so the Syrians today are sighing a huge sign of relief. But at the same time, there is mass sadness because an estimated 100,000 people have disappeared and now basically considered killed by the regime. In a lot of these cases, people don't know where the bodies of their loved ones are. There are generations that have grown up with trauma, basically, in Syria. So this is not something that can be reversed very easily. So there is a lot of hope, but at the same time, the level of trauma is real and widespread and merited. And I think, again, the international community shouldn't just focus on the political side or the security side of what is happening in Syria now. I think the psychological, societal side of the story is hugely important. And also, of course, the economic side. I mean, Syrians are relieved, but at the same time, a lot of people who are already coming back, who had been refugees, are coming back to houses that are just rubble. And so how are these people going to rebuild their lives? They do want to be back home, but they can't, rebuild something from scratch easily. So this is the situation in Syria right now. It's a mixture of emotions.
You mentioned You mentioned the great atrocities that the regime was responsible for. You mentioned Obama's red line and chemical weapons attacks and the prisoners and all of these horrendous stories. Is there a process now, do you think, for kind of seeking accountability? Assad and his family are in Russia. They've been given asylum. They're safe and safe and sound in Moscow. Do you think there'll be a process for seeking justice for some of those crimes?
I mean, Syrians have been working tirelessly since 2011 on getting justice. There are many Syrian-led initiatives by Syrians abroad, some here in the UK, some in Europe. And I know some of these people personally, lawyers who have dedicated their careers to seeking accountability, and they have really tried to use national court jurisdictions, the international laws, to try to come up with mechanisms for accountability, because ultimately this is not just about the Assad family, it's also about all the other people around Assad who are also responsible, whether directly or indirectly, for these atrocities. And so the basis already exists. The human rights organizations that the Syrians have set up and the accountability organizations and initiatives are already out there. Now is a good time for the international community to further empower them by cooperating with them, because now we are seeing the scale of the issue. And this is something that, as I said, is an international responsibility. Whether justice will be served or not fully remains to be seen. At the moment, of course, Russia offered Assad and his family asylum because they do not want them to be held accountable. But this is something that I hope changes. But of course, it will require geopolitical changes regarding Russia's position, whether Russia at some point feels it can, in a way, offer Assad as some kind of compromise in return for other things. Perhaps this can happen further down the line. But for now, I think any measures of accountability need to be supported.
One of the big questions for the future for Syria is about who leads the country. And of course, that will shape how other international governments, allies, partners relate to Syria as well. We've talked a bit about HTS, and we've mentioned that actually, there were kind of a variety of groups involved in bringing down the Assad regime. Can you talk a bit about who you think will end up ultimately kind of coming to the fore, and what that will mean for how the rest of the world engages with Syria?
At the moment, there's a lot of attention on HTS because they were the leading military group in the campaign to remove Assad. And they are definitely politically powerful to the extent that they have chosen one of their members to lead the transition government in Syria. And they have also announced appointing another one as the transitional Minister of Justice. So that shows you how strong they are in the current landscape. So of course they will play a key role. However, even they know that they can't do this on their own. So they can't just replace the Assad government with an HTS government. They only achieved this as part of a coalition with other groups, and these groups will want a seat at the table as well. So we have some other Islamist groups, but there are also other groups that are not Islamist, rebels that came from the south, for example, in Syria. There's also the political opposition abroad. Again, not one opposition, but different kind of bureaus that have been set up, including the one recognized as the representative of the opposition by the UN, for example, the coalition. So you have multiple actors that are Syrian, both from inside and outside, that are playing a role. And of course, one of the things that HTS leaders have said is that it's important to work with people who have been involved with the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And we're seeing already meetings between some of these now former ministers from the Assad government meet with HTS leaders So I think they recognize that the model that Iraq followed after 2003, which is de-Baathification, which is to say no role whatsoever for anyone affiliated with the ousted regime, the Syrians can see that that was not a good idea. So we will see presence and some cooperation with people who are basically now former Assad regime figures. Of course, these figures are not going to be the ones that had led, for example, atrocities inside Naya. They have to pick carefully people who are more pragmatic and who could still be acceptable. But unless there is such a coalition, it's not going to work because the Syrian landscape is very diverse, and whatever combination happens next in terms of governance needs to reflect this political diversity.
You wrote in your piece for us, which was all about kind of how Assad's fall it was all about pragmatism. It was about the opposition groups ultimately being pragmatic, like you're saying, and the powers, other actors in the region also will kind of realign and respond sort of pragmatically to what's happening. Um, one of the one of the things you talked about in the piece was that it's a mistake to kind of see these groups purely through an ideological lens, because it misunderstands how the fact that they will respond pragmatically, and they are responding pragmatically to this situation. One of the fears, I guess, that people have been talking about is, will this look like the Taliban in Afghanistan? Will we suddenly see an Islamist government that's quite extreme, that is sort of, repressing women, for example? There was a report yesterday that HTS came out on social media and said, it is forbidden to tell women what to wear and to police their clothing. Is there any, do you think, you wrote in the piece that those concerns are basically overblown, that there's no real indication that this is what the Islamist groups who are part of this move against Assad want? Can you just break that down a little bit for our listeners? Is that there's no kind of merit in those worries, you think, from what we've seen so far?
First of all, it's very dangerous to parachute other countries' scenarios on Syria. In fact, this kind of parachuting is part of the reason why the UK Parliament, for example, in 2013, voted against intervention in Syria, because people kept bringing up the experience of Iraq and saying, if we intervene in Syria, it'll be just like Iraq. Syria is not Iraq, Syria is not Libya, Syria is not Afghanistan. All those countries have their specificities, their particularities, and we are already seeing, for example, in the statement that you just cited by HTS saying what women wear is none of our business. The Taliban never ever released a statement like that, for example. Also, HTS has evolved over the years to basically become more and more of a political act. And there's a difference between seeking control and seeking to be a political actor. Control is something that, HTS had achieved actually already in northwest Syria, originally through military coercion. So they actually competed with other Islamist groups and won, and said, now we assert ourselves and now we're in charge. And basically, this allows us to impose whatever ideology we like. However, when they started getting political ambitions, this is when they started acting more and more pragmatically. So the statement that they issued is because there are huge parts of Syrian society that would outright reject having, for example, any imposition on what women wear. The Alawite community, although, it's a Muslim community, however, they are quite liberal in the way the women dress in the community. The Druze community, the Christians, even the Sunni community and the Shia community, large parts of them are not conservative. And so the last thing HTS wants is to alienate people in Syria, because it is seeking more and more acceptance as a political actor. So this is the kind of pragmatism that is prevailing. The other indication is accepting working with these different political actors that are not from the same ideological background as HTS in this coalition that I talked about before. So here we see pragmatism trumping ideology. And so if you only look at these groups through the prism of ideology, you will miss what is actually happening, which is, these people want power. And they have recognized that to get power, this is what they have to do. So they are doing it, which is, how political actors elsewhere in the world basically behave.
Lina, this is still a very kind of fast-moving story. We're speaking on the morning of Tuesday, the 10th of December. So by the time this podcast comes out tomorrow morning, the situation could look different again. I wanted to ask you about some of the kind of latest developments that we've seen. We woke up this morning to reports of Israeli airstrikes in Syria. And although Israel is denying other reports that there are tanks now in Syrian territory, can you tell us what you make of these latest reports, the kind of uncertainty around them, and what you think will happen next, where it leaves us?
Yeah, when it comes to Israel, of course, it is welcoming this development in Syria because the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad for the longest time had been convenient for Israel because Assad used to just rhetorically say he was against Israel, but he never fired a single bullet at the Golan Heights that Israel was occupying and still is occupying. And so for Israel, that was a low-level threat that it could live with until things changed with October 7, 2023, because Assad had become so dependent on Iran that Syria became basically a free-for-all when it came to Iranian militias. And when October 7 happened, Iran, obviously as a backer of Hamas, is one of the reasons why this attack was able to happen. And so Israel's calculations about this role for Iran in the region changed. And Assad was no longer tolerated by Israel. And this opened the door for the cascade of opportunities that the Syrian rebels took advantage of. And also, of course, other regional powers and international stakeholders involved in Syria, like Russia. Of course, this took the Iranians by surprise because it was basically all going against their own interests in Syria. Israel right now is benefiting from the defeat, basically, of Iran in Syria. The other thing that Israel wants is preferably, as far as they're concerned, a demilitarized Syria. I mean, this is going to be a bit difficult to achieve in the full sense. However, we can see evidence of this through the Israeli attacks that have happened on the naval force of the Syrian state and attacking military infrastructure belonging to the Syrian Arab forces, which is basically, or the Syrian Arab Army, which is the army of Assad, basically, that although weakened, still had, of course, weapons warehouses and an arsenal and weapons manufacturing facilities. So Israel is now attacking all those. And so this shows that Israel wants to have the military upper hand regarding this new Syrian state that is in the making. And Israel is also, in the name of security, annexing further territory, such as Mount Hermon, which is a very strategic location overlooking both Lebanon and Syria. It kind of transcends the Lebanese-Syrian border. So most of it is on the Syrian side, but basically part of it overlooks Lebanon. And therefore, if Israel has a presence there, then it can have surveillance over huge parts of southern Lebanon as well as Syria. And Israel is basically using the excuse of security to justify this land grab. And I think Israel has already, through statements by the Prime Minister Netanyahu, said that for them, the Golan Heights annexation is permanent. And I think they're counting on the administration of Donald Trump coming in and basically giving the green light for this kind of scenario.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll keep watching, and you can read Lina's piece on our website today. Thank you very much.